Hey, David Brewster here, New Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is Jump in the Fire, Rhythm Guitar Secrets from Hetfield and Mustaine. And it was about a week ago when it was revealed that Megadeth's next album will be their last, and they're going to go on a farewell tour in support of that album. And the news kind of hit me. I was already thinking about Megadeth and stuff. I actually went through some of my books, and I stumbled upon some of these old lessons from Guitar World magazine related to Metallica and Megadeth. So it's been on my mind, and then I've had requests for more Megadeth and Metallica. So I thought about it, and I thought, let's hit some of these ideas that I pulled out of old Guitar World magazine lessons, because it's really cool. And honestly, they're lessons that I kind of skipped over, when I was younger, because I was a shred boy, back in the day. I do remember checking out the Kirk Hammett and Marty Friedman lessons that went along with these, but I did kind of skip over Hetfield and Mustaine's lessons. And then I've gone back through that material, and it's like, wait, there's some really cool ideas they're sharing here. So if you're definitely a Metallica fan, especially the early years, or a Megadeth fan, this lesson's totally for you. So this lesson's really not going to be a lesson on Jump in the Fire, the song from Kill 'Em All. I did play it during the opening just because I felt like I had to, because I titled the video Jump in the Fire. And that's based around G minor blues, right? A very famous riff. Actually, I noticed there's dozens of videos here on YouTube breaking this song down. So we're not really going to look at Jump in the Fire. I mean, I can talk about that riff. But that's not really what we're going to do in this lesson. I just wanted to find a title that kind of worked for what I wanted to show here, because we're going to do a little bit of Metallica and a little bit of Megadeth. And it's interesting that both these lessons that I pulled from Guitar World, both Hetfield and Mustaine, were focusing on efficiency and like economy of motion and finding ways to kind of make chords and rhythms happen with as little movement as possible. And here are the images with the two Guitar World magazines where I pulled this, the October 1991 and December 1991 issues. Now, if you have trouble locating those two issues of Guitar World magazine, which I realize they're over 30 years old now, but this is the book. I was actually going through some of my library and kind of moving through some of my books, and this is from 1994. It's a collection of Guitar World magazine lessons called Private Lessons. I've had this book for a long time, but I hadn't looked through it for a while, and I pulled it out of my stash and started looking through it, and I noticed the Kirk Hammett and Marty Friedman lessons, and I remembered those. And then I was kind of reading through them, and I was like, well, wait, I kind of skipped over Hetfield and Mustaine's. I think I remember reading them, or just kind of like quickly running through some of the riffs and stuff, but I didn't really read the text. I didn't really pay attention because I was a kid. But then sitting down with this book and kind of revisiting that material, I realized what I'd missed, back in 91 when I was kind of looking through the magazines. And it was like, man, there's some cool stuff, hiding in these lessons. So definitely, if you can find a copy of this book, this is a great book. I think Guitar World released some other lesson, books like this. But this one from 94 is great. First up is James Hetfield with his Riffer Madness lesson from the October 91 issue of Guitar World magazine. And during his lesson, he's talking about economy of motion, basically, and finding some ways to fret and perform chords, with as little movement as possible. Of course, keep in mind, Hetfield is singing normally when he plays some of these riffs. And he demonstrated this. So first up, he's doing this. Right? And that's really interesting if you notice the way I fretted that, because he's actually fretting this E5 with his middle finger, and then he basically moves that off and then grabs that B flat right there with his index and pinky. Technically, that's the fingering that was in the magazine. Right. So that's really just a clever way of kind of making that happen. E5 to B flat 5. And then he also demonstrated it there with that F chord. So there's two moves right there, you know, kind of based around that middle finger bar on the E5 and then moving to that B flat and then also moving to that F. So to get used to that, I would just make a simple riff. Like that. You know, something simple to kind of help you get used to making that transition and that move. And then you could do the same thing in, you know, E to F. And just kind of finding some ways of making that happen. And, you know, that's kind of a simple idea, but that actually does save you a little bit of time. Instead of having to move back like this, you can actually just make that happen just like that. So that image I just shared had a quote from James Hetfield from this lesson from the Guitar World October 91, you know, issue. And I've had so many arguments with people, or I guess conversations with people, about the fact that yes, James Hetfield does a lot of downstroke rhythms, but he does alternate strum or pick rhythms too. And there he was talking about battery and how fast it is, and he has to use alternate strumming for that. So there are exceptions. If it's too fast, he does alternate pick or strum those rhythms. It's not always downstrokes, but there's a lot of downstrokes in Metallica's music, of course. Now this next idea from James, you know, we were doing this middle finger bar and then moving from B flat to F like that. And then he shared another one where he's doing an E5 and then he's grabbing G5 like this. Right? And that's really interesting because there we're doing a normal index finger, you know, bar for that E5. And then middle and pinky to grab that G5. So once again, I would just make a simple riff to kind of get used to doing that. You could also move that up to that B flat. Instead of playing B flat here, we could keep that same fingering and grab that B flat 5 right here like this. Just to kind of get used to moving, you know, that chord shape with that fingering. So here's a variation of these ideas, and this didn't appear in the magazine. This is just my own variation, kind of combining these two ideas from James Hetfield. So what if we took all those ideas, those kind of economy of motion movements, and combined them together in the same riff or exercise? And we could do that E to F, and then that E to G, E to B flat, and then back to that E to G and E to F, like this. You know, something like that. It's really not that hard, and you can see we're just basically combining all these ideas together. E, you know, E to F5, you know, using that middle and then that index and pinky kind of fingering, and then do the E to G like that, and then that E to B flat the first way, and then back to that E to G, and then just loop that over and over. This is a really interesting way to play chords and riffs like that, and I can definitely feel it in my fret hand because I'm not used to playing chords like this, you know, using my middle finger and stuff. But then working on this, it's like, man, I'm kind of using, you know, different muscles and, you know, strength in my hand differently just to make some of these moves and ideas happen. That's really cool. Okay, now it's Dave Mustaine's turn, and these ideas are going to come from the Mega Chops lesson that was in the December 1991 issue of Guitar World magazine, and I do remember checking out that lesson, but I was super focused on Marty's section, and I kind of skimmed over Dave's. No offense to Mr. Mustain, but I was a kid, like I mentioned earlier, and then revisiting this lesson in the Private Lessons book, I was like, oh wait, Dave's showing some cool stuff here. So for this, he's basically talking about playing these lower forms of chords and allowing the bass player to play the root. So he's talking about playing like an E5, like this. So that's basically like an E over B, right? You're really just taking the two notes for an E power chord, like that E and B note, but you're putting the B on the bottom. And then he was talking about letting the bass player play the root right there. And he played a riff. That kind of thing. Just to kind of get used to that, you know, kind of one-fingered approach. And that actually sounds really good. If you played that and let your bass player handle the root, or another guitarist could play that low E. It actually does have a really cool sound. It kind of helps separate, you know, things in the mix a little bit, and it doesn't sound quite so muddy when you kind of divide parts and chords like that up. Here's another idea from Dave's lesson, and he's talking about using these major shapes as a substitute for just regular power chords. And right there, that's like B major, you know, that root, you know, the third and octave, B, D sharp, B right there. Like that. And he was doing a riff in there. Kind of get an earful of that sound. So there he was doing like the first riff with just straight power chords, so you can kind of hear a difference. Right? And then do the same riff, but then substitute and use those major shapes there. Right? And that's kind of cool to kind of hear the... and then hear the difference between that and... And I think in the lesson he actually started that with F sharp and then that G major, A major, B flat major, but I just changed them all to those major shapes because it sounds really cool. Okay, last but not least is Dave Mustaine's famous spider chord technique, and I have featured this before. Dave Mustaine's definitely talked about this. I've seen videos online with him breaking this down. I think I talked about this before in one of the Megadeth chord play episodes, you know, here on my channel, but I wanted to include this again because we're talking about this kind of economy of motion, efficient moves, you know, on the fretboard and things you can do with chords, you know, like in the metal rhythm guitar style. And here's an image with Megadeth songs. There's also Ride the Lightning, too, from Metallica, which you got to remember Dave Mustaine co-wrote that song. But here's some places where you can actually hear the spider chord, you know, in action. And then we're going to talk about and kind of break this down. But check out some of these songs right here from Megadeth and Metallica to hear the spider chord technique. So I think one of the best places to actually hear the spider chord technique in action is the song Wake Up Dead from Peace Sells. And I've actually shared this before, but I wanted to share it again because it's cool and it's actually a useful thing you can do on the fretboard. And this is that middle section kind of thrash riff, and that's when you hear it like this. Like that, and it's this thing. That's the spider chord right there. And that's really deceptively hard because you're basically holding an E5 like that, and then you're moving over to the low E and the A, and you're grabbing that C right there. So that's the spider move right there. And you can either lift your, you can lift your fingers up or you can leave them down. Just make sure you don't let that E5, like that B note of that E5 continue to ring. Because you're doing that. And then, and there it is again, because you're doing that E to C, and then E flat D to that D flat, and then you're grabbing A right there. And then that C to B, and then you're grabbing B flat there. He starts the riff there. Like that. That's pretty crafty too, the way he starts B flat there and then does the spider chord maneuver and then relocates to that B flat suddenly. But right there, slowly we're doing that. And that's the spider chord maneuver right there. Really interesting just to find like a totally different way of making chords and chord progressions happen. And you have to admit you'd have to jump around a lot more to make that riff happen, without the spider chord. But experiment with that, and then definitely seek out some of those other songs from Megadeth and Metallica to hear more of that spider chord technique action. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Brewster's Millions of Rants with Jump in the Fire, rhythm guitar secrets from Hetfield and Mustaine. Definitely two powerhouse, metal guitar legends, for sure. They changed the game. And they used to work together, and then they almost became like arch enemies for a long time. I think they put a lot of those fires out over the years. But definitely, once upon a time, there was a lot of animosity and tension, between Metallica and Megadeth, especially between their fans. And it's funny, when I see people talking smack about Metallica online these days, it always makes me laugh, because it really wasn't that long ago you would have got your ass kicked saying stuff like that. Like back when I was in high school or whatever, you didn't mess with Metallica, because if a Metallica fan heard what you said, they'd kick your ass in the bathroom or out in the parking lot after school or something. I mean, they were die-hard, devoted, and very protective of their band, whether it was Metallica or Megadeth. And then you got a Metallica fan and a Megadeth fan in the same room. I mean, you might as well just call the cops, because, you never knew what they were going to do or start fighting or something. But things have definitely changed, in today's world. And when I saw that news about Megadeth's last album, last tour, coming up and stuff, I was like, oh no, something else that's going away or disappearing or changing, in the modern age. And I grew up, worshiping both these bands, loving Metallica, loving Megadeth. I've admitted this in other videos. Yes, I'm a big Megadeth fan, but I'm also a big Metallica fan too. So can't we just get along and admit that both these bands kick ass and are essential, because they are. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.